Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten, your host. Today we have back with us Karl Fabrizius. He is the pastor of Our Father Lutheran Church in Greenfield, Wisconsin. Welcome back.
Thanks, Jason. Good to be here.
So usually we have you on to talk about like Old Testament and its, how it relates to the New Testament and how we see, pictures of our Lord's death and resurrection or his passion in events from the Old Testament and how exciting that is to see Christ in the Old Testament. Today, we're going to do something different. For so many years now, having come on to the Gottesdienst staff and, having hung around you guys for a number of years, there is a name that keeps popping up, the Reverend Stephen Wiest. And from the stories that I hear told, he was instrumental in liturgical revival, confessional Lutheran revival, and then also kind of a revival in preaching and seeing Christ in the Old Testament, at least in Wisconsin and perhaps throughout the Synod. And so I thought it would be good if we could see some kind of modern heroes who are no longer with us and what they stood for, what they did, so that we also then can emulate what they have done in our own time. So I know that you knew Stephen Wiest, and so I thought you'd be perfect to have on to talk about his contribution to what Gottesdienst stands for.
Yeah, where to begin with that? Stephen was a gifted individual in so many ways. And at the same time, he and I kind of had this parallel existence that somehow brought us together. I know that sounds kind of weird and science fiction-y, but then I'm kind of that way. We first met, actually, he came to Fort Wayne to the seminary, and he was a scary dude. He had this eye thing so that you felt like he was staring at you no matter where you moved. But it was simply, you got over it after a while, but it was just one of those weird things. He'd give you the eye, and he wasn't even giving you the eye, really.
Yeah.
So he and I would chat then, but I went away, came to Milwaukee.
So he was a pastor at the time, and you were a student?
No, he was not yet a pastor.
Okay.
He had been at Trinity Deerfield for a while, but he had been on an odyssey. He grew up here in Milwaukee at Luther Memoriam, which is where Michael Larson is now. Mm-hmm. Before that, it was Ken Weeding. And actually, the pastor there was still there he was retired, but still around in those days. But he had grown up there and then, like so many, wandered off to college like I did. And both of us had gotten into some rather weird paganistic ways, because college does that to a person often.
Yeah. And
he ended up getting a degree in journalism. And he would do these things where he, went backstage at rock and roll bands and stuff. So he could tell you all these stories about rock and roll and being backstage with Steely Dan or some other group and things that went on there. And he was, at that time, as he said, he was certainly not a Christian. Mm-hmm. He was really in the dark side of things. And then he had some events in his life kind of shook him up, and he ended up kind of getting attracted to evangelicalism, and Trinity, mm-hmm. was a place nearby. Well, then he started reading the Confessions. I know this sounds like just weird stories, but he actually got back to being Lutheran, went to Fort Wayne, and from Fort Wayne, he and his wife went off to Ghana in Africa. But he came back home from Ghana when his parents were dying, and they never went back to Ghana. He was not popular, shall we say, with the mission department, although when I went to Ghana, people remembered Pastor Wiest and thought fondly of him. But the mission department thought he was a little too Lutheran for some of the things happening in Ghana at that time. And so they were kind of happy he went home, and they didn't let him go back again.
This all sounds very familiar, even to this day.
Does that not sound familiar? We've seen that movie too?
Yeah.
That's an old reference to an Elton John song, actually. So, which is fitting, because Wiest and I would have these conversations in rock and roll all the time.
Yeah.
Because of our backgrounds. Both of us had been big music freaks. And so he ended up coming back to Milwaukee. So our paths crossed again. He came back and got the call to UWM. In those days, there was a campus pastor, and they had a building there even. And a couple times I got to preach there, actually, when he needed to go on vacation or something. We got to know each other a little bit more, because we also would talk some stuff about graduate pursuits. Both of us had interest in that. And so, but even as it had been with the mission department, so it was with the district officers at that point in time. They weren't so happy that he was trying to be Lutheran at the Lutheran chapel there. And
that's crazy, isn't it? I mean, a Lutheran chapel would be Lutheran.
Yeah, I mean, even though he would go out of his ways to do like daily services and all kinds of things to try to appeal to students, but of course he didn't like have huge numbers. Who would think so? Colleges don't necessarily get the huge numbers. So the district decided they wanted him out, and of course, it's all about what word are we supposed to use now?
Money.
Process, man.
Oh,
it's about the process.
Oh, that's right.
And it was about the process. It was about, of course, financial advisors. It wasn't really about the Word of God.
Transparency.
He had a call to serve there, because that congregation had an independent status at that point. He had been given a call to come. There were some people in the community he was serving, but mainly it was. And I suppose they thought, because Pastor Wiest, whom we often called Beatnik, because he was this sort of interesting character. I mean, he had played, he loved to play the mouth harp, the harmonica. I mean, he had been on recordings with guys like, he'd been down in Jamaica with, I'm going blank here. This is part of my aging process. Anyway, he'd played on an album, and he could really play the harmonica. Great blues harmonica. And in fact, he still played with some local groups around here, some guys, who were total pagans, but they loved his music.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he was a guy who could talk to anybody. He talked to the witches on campus at UWM, you got a kick out of talking with them. But it became a matter of confession for him that he would wear his cassock, because the district told him he couldn't. So then he'd start wearing his cassock all the time on campus, which drew attention and also gave him an opportunity to talk to people. I mean, for him, it was just an opening to many conversations. But for the district, it just made him angrier. And so the process included meetings. I was in some. Pastor Bender was in some. Pastor Weeding was involved in some. And basically, mainly, it was one of the guys from the district was sent, and he was trying to convince Wiest to just resign, get out of there. Well, he wouldn't do that. And they eventually just closed down the campus ministry, just shut it down and took his call away. And while this was going on, he was also starting his graduate work at Marquette and working on a doctorate there. He and I continued to meet, usually on about once a week. We'd meet at Marquette, have lunch, and we'd talk biblical text. Basically, that was what it was about. He'd update me on the process, but mainly it was to sit around and talk biblical text. I mean, he was just a fascinating character, knew his Greek just so well, and yet I could come with the Old Testament stuff, so we'd be bouncing things back and forth about this. It was really a lot of fun. See, I shouldn't have so much fun. Talking about the Bible, I always tell kids in school, the Bible's just too much fun. And it really is.
Yeah.
And so we'd sit around and talk about that. Well, they eventually got rid of him, and he was left to just hang out. And then my senior pastor retired, and I'd been an associate for 16 years. And with his retirement, I was able to give Wiest a part-time position first, and then brought him in to our fathers.
Okay.
He got the associate position. The district didn't want either one of us. I mean, when the congregation had to decide about a senior pastor before this, the district tried to tell the congregation, you can't have Fabrizius. He's been there too long, and, you can't have him. Well, the congregation told him, look, we know him, we like him, we're keeping him. So they kept me around, and then I brought Wiest on board, so they had both of us in one place.
Yeah.
So that was kind of interesting, and it was just, Wiest was so good at interacting with people. We were big enough in those days that you always kind of have people who are drawn to personalities. Wiest and I were identical theologically, but our personalities were just totally different.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one of the first things he did when he came here to serve as an associate was 3 houses away. We had this palm reader. He says, I got to go visit her. He goes down and visits with the palm reader for about an hour and a half. And, got to know her by name, would see her in the grocery store and say hi to her. She never did figure him out, She claimed to be a pious Roman Catholic. It was a fascinating conversation he had with her and told me about. But, that was not my deal. I'm just not that kind of guy. Just go up and knock on the door and say, hey, I want to talk to the palm reader. But he was that way. He was just so good at reaching out to people about having initial contact. And his preaching was very good as well. So we kind of complemented each other. We had a lot of fun. Now it was no longer that we had to go have lunch together. We had offices next to each other. We'd be talking about the Bible all the time. What a waste of time. We could have been having meetings. But instead, we were talking about the Bible and just enjoying life. So it was then that something started bothering his throat region. And he was having some issues. And it was, the great thing about it was we had so much fun because the initial diagnosis was that he had cat scratch fever. So you can imagine what that was like, the two of us singing cat scratch fever. Well, unfortunately, it was worse than that. Yeah. It was cancer. He ended up only serving at our father's 3 years. A lot of that time ended up with him being in the hospital. The people here were great. They continued to pay him even though he was gone a lot of the time. They supported his family. They brought meals. They did other things. It was one of those times that draws a congregation together, that here he was, even though he was new in many ways. Yeah. They just surrounded him and showed so much love to him. And those things happen actually once in a while. They knew that he loved, I know this sounds way pious for me. They knew that he loved Jesus. He actually cared about Jesus. Mm-hmm. And that mattered to them. And his honesty and all of it, the last time he preached here, he was very weak. But they came, they visited him at times. They supported him even when he went away to Minneapolis to get a bone marrow transplant. They continued to pay him, continued to see that things were taken care of. So I can't say enough about how warm and loving the congregation was during those days. And it was good for the congregation. His death did bring them together. But of course, it's never perfection. And sin raised its evil head after his death too. And things happened that led to difficulties. But Wiest himself was He was a great preacher. He understood the liturgy and the importance of the liturgy. His liturgical life at UWM was great. He was willing to speak openly to people about the importance of the liturgy. Some guys that were at UWM when he was there actually went to seminary. So he had a good, he had that journey.
Yeah.
He and I would joke that we both had kind of seen the dark side in college, and him afterwards as well. And so we understood, to us, maybe the two of us kind of had a favorite parable, the parable of the prodigal son.
Yeah.
The merciful God who is long-suffering with people. He put up with a Wiest, he put up with me, and, actually brought us together to sort of enjoy some things we held in common, at the same time really realize how fortunate we were. And that's a bad word, I know. Shouldn't use that term, but how by the grace of God, let's use that term.
Yeah.
We had both been drawn out of darkness into light again. And the opportunity to, sing all kinds of rock and roll together, which we did, along with our principal, who also was a rock and roll guy in those days. We were just kind of products of a generation. At the same time, we also were, as I joke now, we have hymns of the faith and hymns of the world. And we loved the hymns of the world as much as we did the hymns of the faith.
Yeah.
And we knew that the problems of the hymns of the world and how it could overwhelm people and draw you deep into some pretty dark things. We had, of course, come out of the same generation that, both of us had in our days thought extremely highly of Stranger in a Strange Land, the Heinlein classic, and kind of got a little bit too weird about that book for a bit in our younger days. So we had a lot of common paths, and somehow we got brought together for 3 short years, 3 a nice number of death and resurrection, and got to talk about the gospel with each other a lot, as well as with the people here at Our Fathers. Okay, I've rambled for a long time.
No, it's great. So you met, you guys were students together at the seminary, or no?
Yes, I was 4th year and he was 2nd. We met.
Okay. All right. So he was a little bit younger than you. And
well,
I mean, in terms of graduating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he was slightly older than me. He was born, this is kind of off, I think it was 53. I am born in 56, so he was about 3 years older than me. He died at the age of 53.
Oh my goodness. So when he was at Madison, you said that there were a number of people that...
No, UW Milwaukee. I'm sorry, I was not clear about that.
Oh, okay, UW Milwaukee. When he was in Milwaukee, then, so what were the students who he was influential that became pastors, and where are they now? I assume they all went to Fort Wayne at the time, at least, right?
Yeah, the one I remember actually never became a pastor, which is weird. But I spent the most time with him, and that would be, you probably know Latif Gaba.
Yeah.
But Latif's brother also came and joined the congregation here because of that, and we had a Lutheran school too, and he wanted to send his child to. So there's that. Latif is connected to that background. I'm trying to remember who was the other person. These, when they don't live near you and they kind of drift away in time.
Yeah. So he had come to understanding being confessional Lutheran before entering seminary, and then seminary really kind of solidified that. Is that fair to say?
Yes, and he was brilliant. I mean, for all his oddities, and maybe a lot of us have those oddities, so I shouldn't say it, but people looked at him as being odd. Of course, then again, my wife says everybody looks at me that way. So, but he was just brilliant. And the first time I talked to him, I remember this guy comes and he's a 2nd-year student. He admits, he tinkered around with these different groups and investigated the ELCA and well, of course, it wasn't the ELCA in those days. That merger hadn't taken place yet, but he'd looked at those various things, and he could just talk and know the text of the confessions already, as well as the biblical texts.
Yeah.
He'd enjoyed some of the biblical stuff he did other places, but in the end, he came to Fort Wayne. Now, as we all know, seminary is not perfect, and he had some frustrations with certain individuals too.
Mm-hmm.
But
and what years was this?
Well,
at SEM?
That would have been 83, 84 when we met.
Okay.
Because that was my final year on campus.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So he was instrumental in kind of pushing and pressing to have a liturgical, confessional, Lutheran university, campus ministry.
Correct.
And so what are the things that he came up against besides, what was stated by the district? What are the things that he had to actually fight against that was going on in synod? And how did he make that case to the people who were kind of against him?
Well, he wanted to talk about the importance of being Lutheran
mm-hmm.
in the face of the challenges of an academic environment that even in the 90s, you have to remember, like I graduated from Marquette in the early 90s. Well, in the 80s already at Marquette, you had all these Marxist professors.
Yeah.
And UWM was even further overboard. So you had all these encouragements that were attacking our students on campus, and his point was we have to be faithful to the biblical text, and the liturgy helps us remain faithful to that. His Bible studies that he offered, he would, he appealed to different groups that he disagreed with to have debates with him about doctrine, and so he was doing this openly on campus, and kind of angered the local priestess, a couple of the priestesses from other denominations. They weren't too happy with him, but he was openly doing these things, and that was not what the district officials wanted. They wanted somebody who was going to play games with the kids, and offer them contemporary worship, because of course that appeals to that generation, was their thought, and all of this kind of thing. And they wanted watered down Lutheranism, and that simply was not what Wiest was going to give them. He was going to challenge them. They were in an academic environment anyway, and he attempted to challenge them every way he could in terms of, so, for example, he did have a confessions class for the college students, even though that meant you had to talk about some modern contemporary things that the district wasn't happy about him talking about, and put the district on the spot at times. The question of how frequent communion should be held. The district didn't like him having communion so frequently. And you had these other things that they couldn't really argue with him with, so they used, like I said, the process in those days, and eventually just said it was too expensive to have him around. They never really, they couldn't charge him with false teaching or anything.
Yeah.
But that was his point. He wanted to debate, let's talk about the call of the office of the ministry and what all that means and what we're saying when we just strip someone for no reason at all other than we don't like what he's doing there. And eventually, because he kept pushing back, that meant the only way they could win was give up the building, even though the building was across the street from the campus, the union, the student union. It was a perfect location, but they gave up the building.
So in essence, they gave up prime real estate to preach and teach the gospel because they disagreed with how Pastor Wiest went about it.
That would be my argument.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
They would probably give you a different
they'd rather
story.
So they'd rather not do it at all than have it done the way that the guy who was called there to do it.
Yes. I mean,
Totally makes sense to me,
What
man.
happened as a result of that was that Ken Wheating took over it at Luther Memorial, which is a few blocks away. And they did an excellent job. I mean, they've done a good job there at Luther Memorial, continuing it. And of course, I mean, Ken was one of the supporters of Steve, and you had Bender gave him shelter as well. I mean, for a while, Bender gave him a congregation with a roof over his head and had him do some associate kind of work there and just fill in as best as he could for a while. So he had to patch things together.
Yeah.
But Steve stayed steadfast through it all. Finances were difficult, stress on the family, all that was true, but people tried to gather around them and support them. And then with the retirement of my senior pastor, it just opened the door to what we thought would be a long and wonderful relationship. The Lord had other plans.
Yeah. What, so you've mentioned just how brilliant he was, and, just how keen he was at looking at the biblical text and interpretation. I mean, what are some of the things that are kind of thought of as kind of standard means of interpreting, maybe parables or certain events of the New Testament or in light of the Old Testament? What are some of those things that seem standard now, but that he either figured out or puzzled through or kind of refound because of his studies? Things that we take for granted today, but that at those early days, weren't so common.
What best to say? I mean, his dissertation, which is like 400 pages plus footnotes, is about the angel of the Lord and all the angelic uses. And he looks at all the liberal sources as well as the conservative sources and the early church sources. And it's quite different from the Gieschen approach to it. And the fact that he was so well thought of by the faculty on campus, his advisor, Julian Hills, who is a New Testament prof, and actually kind of a devout Episcopalian, who in the final days when Wiest was in hospice, he came and sang hymns with us as we sang at Wiest bedside. But it was through Hills that Wiest got invited to the Jesus seminar. He was allowed to do a presentation on the book of Acts and the biblical authority of that text to the Jesus seminar.
He took him up on it, didn't he?
Oh, he did, yeah. He went. They paid for him to go to San Francisco and address this group. I mean, what the heck? I would have done it. He had a lot of fun. I mean,
so he met Dominic Crossan, and
I can't remember who was on the Jesus seminar anymore. I mean, he met all those guys. He had some good conversations with them, he said, but of course, as he pointed out, he couldn't convince any of them. To his point of view, even though they liked some, they said, "Boy, I never thought it that way." Which Wiest could do to people. He'd be talking through the text, and they'd say, "I never even thought of that."
Yeah,
and so he just, and of course, that was another thing. The congregation let him do things like that. Go out to the Jesus seminar. I mean, who would have thought a guy from the south side of Milwaukee? I mean, who was a pastor on the south side, which in Milwaukee, if you're really important, you're on the north side.
Right.
The south siders are, kind of the old, it used to be the people who were in the unions and the blue collar people and that kind of thing. And then the north side, that's where all the classy people are. So those of us who didn't have much class, we hung out on the south side. Yeah. And, but there he was with the Jesus seminar, and he could hold his own anywhere.
Yeah.
And get him laughing. And of course, he did make sure he played a little harmonica for him too, little blues. Yeah. Wherever he went, he had his mouth harp. He had a few of them actually, and then he'd play a little blues and get going.
Yeah. So I just have kind of two last questions. One is, so what what about your interaction with him? It's kind of like a twofold question. Do you miss, and how did that relationship kind of change you in the way that you look at now what you do day in and day out? That's the first thing.
What do I miss the most is daily spending time talking about text.
Yeah.
I mean, that was irreplaceable. I mean, I had a habit of calling Fritz Eckart in the days when you didn't have cell phones.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd try to talk once a week, and we'd spend time talking about biblical text, because both of us tended to be a little bit edgy about our thoughts about the text. Now, you guys take some of these things as normal now, but,
Yeah.
I mean, you sit down with Wiest and you're talking about the rich man and Lazarus, and, of course, thinking about the poor man as being a figure of Christ, and the dogs licking his wounds, and, of course, the psalm about the dogs gathered around the... So we're sitting around just talking about these things, and we know we're being very Lutheran about things, but we're wandering into things that some people are uncomfortable admitting. I mean, even the prodigal son, and the case of, is the prodigal son an image of Jesus?
Mm-hmm.
And the connection then in that the fourfold parables there that happen in Luke 15 and 16.
Mm-hmm.
The places that most of the guys that were around, you couldn't talk that way with. With Wiest, we could just kind of go anywhere. We would talk about David and about things happening in the David account, and talk about various issues with regard to both of our studies in graduate school. So it was a place where we could, and then he could kind of encourage me, because I was different than his personality. At the same time, he needed encouragement to be bold about things he was doing, because he was confronting some of our delinquent members and doing stuff like that, because that was sort of right up his alley. And like I said, he could talk to anybody. And so he'd come back, but he always told me, he said, you can't win them all. You just talk to them a bit. Someplace you just got to wash your hands.
Mm-hmm.
And go away. But you're not supposed to say that in the Missouri Synod. So there are just some people you just, at a certain point, you hope and pray they come back, but you can't.
Mm-hmm.
I know we're told, the speech of certain officials is that you're supposed to save all these people. But you can't do it. All you can do is be faithful.
Yeah.
And Wiest was faithful, and he was a good encourager of me. Mm-hmm. And I think, if anything, although the years following his death were extremely hard financially in the congregation, and some people left because it was just me and my personality wasn't their gig, well, they went usually to places where the Lord's word wasn't as important too. I know that's highly judgmental of me to say, it just kind of is the truth. And so, those about the next 10 years were really hard. Plus, it was the years my sons were growing up, and one went away to college, and two went away to college, and all this is going on while we're having financial issues here. But Wiest taught me to sort of endure these things and just be faithful, because they aren't necessarily going to like you. And I knew that, but seeing his life and his experiences helped me to be all that much clearer about it, shall we say. Mm-hmm. And so I often, though, think of him. It's strange, I'm getting older, so I'm thinking of him more.
Yeah.
And, there are still some people around here remember him.
Mm-hmm. Was he married? Did he have a family?
Yes. He was married and had 2 daughters. Well, actually, 3. There was a stillborn child, too.
Okay.
But they've moved away. I think they're all in Arizona, maybe. I haven't had contact with them in years.
Yeah.
So,
I guess, what kind of encouragement can the modern pastor who might have to face similar things, what does his Pastor Wiest's life and work, and even his sufferings, what should they, how should they encourage us to remain faithful?
Well, just look at what he did. He went off to Ghana, which is to live there, mm-hmm. and to be part of founding a mission congregation there. And where he was living, I saw where he lived in Ghana, and it was pretty bad. And yet he had gone off there, and he was trying to be liturgical, be faithful to the Bible, teaching the scriptures, visiting people, just going about that work. And yet the organized church, the Missouri Synod, didn't want that. And they brought it, when he came home, they stopped him.
Mm-hmm.
And they tried to stop him again, didn't they, when he was doing the campus work. And then he just kept being faithful. He got beaten up pretty badly, but he had support. There were guys who supported him. Bender and Weeding and Cook. I should mention Aaron Cook was part of that group too. And then there were the vicars who knew him, who benefited from just knowing him over the years. Some of them still have his sermons. A guy like Torkelson, who's here in this district, or, some of the other vicars of Weeding over the years. I mean, Larson was one of the vicars up there.
Okay.
So you've got guys who have benefited simply from, in some cases, reading his sermons, had access to that. But he helped all of us who were here. The group that helped him, he was helping us, because he was always open to talking about the text. And as brilliant as he was also so down to earth and fun. I mean, you can't help but go off and, hear him. I hear him playing the blues harp, and anytime I hear somebody playing a good harmonica, I have to think of him.
Yeah.
So,
well, thanks for taking this time to kind of talk about someone that, again, I've heard so much about, but have never met, and to learn just a bit more about his history and his contribution to, what Gottesdienst has stood for. So yeah, thank you for taking us through.
Well, I hope it's beneficial to people. It's kind of fun to remember these things, even though now it's 20 years ago almost since he died. He died in 2003. But his profound impact is ultimately just the fact that he encourages all of us, study the scriptures, have fun with the text, and don't be willing to be wrong sometimes. I mean, you've got that blunder out there too.
Yeah.
And some of the things we'd say privately to each other were crazy.
Yeah.
But it allowed us to get to some good points too.
Mm-hmm. Well, it also seems like, one of the takeaways is just be human. Like, to go up and be curious about this, this palm reader, or to play the harmonica in front of the Jesus seminar instead of kind of scoffing at it all. He had a way, it sounds like, of just, as you said, being very down to earth, but also being very curious and wanting to get to know people on perhaps their own terms, so that he might, not just as an opportunity to preach the gospel, but as to get to know them as a human being, and then as that opportunity arose, to be able to tell them what he's all about.
And the impact on those professors at Marquette. I mean, Julian Hills, who didn't necessarily believe the New Testament was historically true, but still loved the text. And so Wiest kind of became part of his family. They had Wiest over to the house to have dinner with them and this. And then my dear Hebrew professor, she was suffering from cancer at the same time. And she had minor contact with Wiest, but appreciated his he had that outgoing ability. She went and saw him when he was dying too. And then she came to the church. Even though she was a Jew, she came to the visitation to encourage his wife. And just his impact on people, I think, in some ways made me envious, because I don't know that I have that impact. But he just had that ability to, yes, win people over, acknowledging at the same time, not all of them were going to believe it either. But it opened some doors for him, and he was always about Christ wherever he went.
Well, thank you so much for taking us through this and for your time. And I look forward to chatting with you again.
All right. Thanks a lot.